This past week has been a very difficult one. Hamas returned the remains of Kfir and Ariel Bibas to Israel. Their mother, Shiri, was still missing up until yesterday, in which her body was also returned and now positively identified by the forensics units of Israel. The image of Shiri clutching her children is burned in our memory, and it serves as a symbol of Hamas's brutality. Seth Mendel, writing in Commentary magazine, remarked that Hamas's treatment of the hostages and their bodies is not merely a crime against individuals, but a crime against civilization. Kfir's face, he writes, became a symbol of the conflict because it represented a line that should not have been crossed and that cannot be uncrossed. Those who attended the demonstrations against Israel, he wrote, were no longer simply pro-Palestinian or anti-colonial. They were about defending those who stole Kfir from his home and dragged him to Gaza, where, according to the IDF, he and his family were brutally murdered. And it is impossible for the rest of us, Seth writes, to pretend that we didn't see a chunk of society, whether in person or online, rush to cross that line and cheer the people who kidnapped a baby. Now, I recognize that Seth's statements are a broad generalization. And yet, as Matt Berkowitz noted on the most recent episode of Call Me Back with Dan Senor, the ideology of Hamas is not limited to a small group. It's hard to tell how many Gazans are truly supportive of Hamas. But we do know that Hamas is supported by some countries, such as Qatar and Turkey, and it's supported by others in the Mideast and around the world, including individuals here in the United States and in Canada and in North America and Western countries as well. That's millions of people. There is a difference between advocating for Palestinian rights and supporting terror. And while one can critique Israel's policies, no moral society can justify the slaughter of civilians. This week's Torah reading, Mishpatim, offers a stark contrast to Hamas's worldview. It calls upon us to uphold justice, to protect the vulnerable, and recognize the dignity of every human being. In Shemot, Exodus 22, verses 20 to 23, God commands us, Ger lo toneh velo tilchatzenu, you shall not wrong or oppress the stranger, ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Kol almana v'yatom lo ta'anun, you, communal leaders, shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan. Im anet ta'anet oto, because if you do mistreat them, the Torah says, Ki im tza'ok yitz'ak elai, I will hear their cry, shamoa eshma tza'akato, as soon as I hear it. The Torah repeatedly reminds us of our obligation to protect the weak, the homeless, the orphan, the stranger, because a society is not judged by the way in which it treats the strong, but how it defends the defenseless. Oded Lifshitz, another of the hostages returned this week killed by Hamas, embodied these very values. A peace activist, co-founder of Kibbutz Nir Oz, he and his wife Yocheved worked for a group called On the Way to Recovery. This was a group, an Israeli organization that aided Palestinian civilians, that went to Gaza and brought those in need of medical care directly in their own cars to hospitals across the border. And yet Hamas, the very group that rejected every moral principle he upheld, murdered him. Even in relationship to our enemies, the Torah in this week's Parsha teaches us to act with justice. A little later in the Parsha, Ki tifka shor avicha, Ti kifka shor oivecha, O chamoro to'eh hashev tishivenu lo. When you encounter your enemy's ox or his donkey wandering, says the Torah, you're obligated to return it to its owner. Ki terecha mor sonacha rovetz tachat masa'o. And when you see the donkey of your enemy lying underneath its burden, v'chadalta me azov lo azov ta'azov imo, you should resist the urge to refrain from raising it, and you must help your enemy nevertheless. The Eitz Chaim Chumash on this pasuk notes that the Torah commands us neither to love nor to hate our enemy. It commands behavior, not feelings. Its goal is justice, which it views as being attainable. Hasidic commentaries go even further than the Eitz Chaim Chumash. Mishpatim, they argue, is even more foundational than the Aseret HaDibrot, than the Ten Commandments themselves. They make this point with a creative rereading of the first pasuk of the Torah, of the Parsha. Ve'ela hamishpatim asher tasim leifnehem. These are the rules that you should place before them. The common reading of lifnehem is referring to the rules of mishpatim that you place lifnehem before Bnei Yisrael. But the Hasidic commentaries read it, Ve'ela hamishpatim asher tasim lifnehem. These are the rules that you should place before the Aseret HaDibrot, before the Ten Commandments. Rabbi Simcha Bunin, one of the great Hasidic masters, points out that Mishpatim deals with laws that are ben Adam lechavero, between a person and another person. He writes, do not think that religion is fire and brimstone, thunder and lightning from Mount Sinai alone. Do not think that religion is relegated to the rare moments of hearing God speak. Do not think that religion is confined to the relationship one develops with the divine alone. Religion, he writes, is cultivating a sensitivity and a relationship with the other. When the verse says, Ve'ela hamishpatim asher tasim lifnehem, when it says that these are the rules that you should set before them, Bunin teaches that it means that this cultivation of the relationship between one person and another comes even lifnei, even before the cultivation of the relationship between Adam lemakom, between a human being and God. Justice is not abstract. Justice is a way of life. And our response to our response to evil is not to mirror its cruelty, which is so easy to do. I find so often in looking at the pictures of those who are celebrating Hamas, whether in Israel or here, I feel my heart hardening. And I struggle with how to keep a softness to it and maintain a moral posture in light of what so clearly is repugnant to me and makes me want to just say, hell with it. Don't care about them at all. But that cannot be our response, even in the midst of fighting a war against our enemies. Our response to evil is not to mirror its cruelty. Our response must be to reaffirm our values, the values of Torah, through our actions. In the face of tragedy, we must continue to act morally. And so we will. As this crisis continues to unfold, we must continue to advocate for the release and return of all the remaining hostages, both those living and dead. We must ensure that the world does not forget them. We must stand against anti-Semitism and moral blindness and combat the narratives that justify terror and distort the truth. We must defend justice with integrity and support those efforts that align with Jewish values, upholding the dignity of all human beings, even in times of war, maybe even especially in times of war. And we must strengthen our own community by deepening our commitment to acts of kindness, justice, and Jewish learning. We honor those we've lost, not only in mourning, but in action, in building a world worthy of their sacrifice, a world worthy of Mishpatim, of this morning's Torah reading. Shabbat Shalom.